She raised him like her own, gave everything she had, and he thanked her by kicking her to the curb. It was a Thursday evening, the kind of day when the sun seems unsure of itself, not knowing whether to shine brightly or call it quits early. Miss Eleanor stood on the front porch in her house slippers, holding a grocery bag with a French roll, a few canned goods, and a rotisserie chicken still warm inside its plastic wrap. She leaned her hip against the front door, her door, and immediately sensed something was off. The key didn't fit. She tried again, slowly, then quickly, flipped the key upside down, as if the problem were her, not thinking straight. But it wasn't her hand that was wrong, it was the lock. Someone had changed it. She knocked once, then twice, then harder, still holding the grocery bag, still wearing her blue knit cardigan that smelled faintly of lavender, still standing where she had lived for 22 years. The door opened only a crack. Madison, Elijah's girlfriend, peeked through, eyebrows raised like she wasn't expecting anyone. "Oh, hi. We didn't think you'd be back this early." Eleanor blinked. "Why can't I get into my house?" Madison hesitated, glanced over her shoulder, then pulled the door shut behind her. "I think Elijah was going to talk to you about that." "Talk to me about what?" "You don't live here anymore." Silence fell like a brick. Eleanor tightened the grip on the grocery bag, suddenly unsure what to do with her hands. Her chest tightened. "What did you just say?" Madison gave a nervous smile, the kind people wear when pretending everything's normal. "Look, it's just paperwork stuff, nothing personal. Elijah said you agreed to transfer the deed." What? "He said you signed a few weeks ago, remember? All those forms on the kitchen table?" Eleanor stared, and slowly the realization began to settle. The forms. The way Elijah brushed off her question, saying it was just to get things organized, that this protects the house in case something happens to you. She had trusted him, her son, and now her hands were trembling. Madison didn't wait for more questions. She slipped back inside, mumbling something about calling Elijah. The door shut again, locked again. Eleanor stood there for a full minute, then 5, then 10. No one opened the door again, and she didn't knock. She stepped down the porch slowly, the chicken tucked under her arm like a sleeping baby. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she wasn't going back inside. But Elijah hadn't just taken her house. He had taken something deeper, and Eleanor was about to remember exactly who she had been long before all of this, before the papers, before Madison, before her own porch had become foreign land. Eleanor had been more than just a woman in a house. She had been a mother, and not just to anyone, but to a child nobody else wanted. Back in 1996, Eleanor worked the night shift at Mercy General Hospital in Cedar Falls, Indiana. She was a steady-footed, soft-spoken nurse, the kind of woman who had long since made peace with the idea of never having children after 2 miscarriages and a failed round of fertility treatments. The pain had left no scars on her skin, but deep ones in her soul. Then, one night, she met Elijah. He came in with a broken wrist, barely 2 years old, pale and underfed, wearing a t-shirt 3 sizes too big with ketchup stains on the collar. The woman from the shelter didn't even stay, just left him with social services and walked away. Eleanor wasn't looking to adopt, but sometimes God doesn't knock. Sometimes he just places a baby in your arms and dares you to let go. Elijah didn't speak for the first few days. He just clung to her scrubs like ivy on a wall. He wouldn't talk to anyone else, wouldn't eat unless she fed him. Something in her made him feel safe, and that was enough. 2 months later, she filed the initial paperwork. 6 months after that, he had her last name. Her friends thought she was crazy, a single black woman nearing 40, adopting a white boy with behavioral issues. "Girl, are you trying to save the world?" "No," she'd say, "just this one." Eleanor gave Elijah everything she never had: a race car-shaped bed, lunch boxes with his name written in marker, swim classes, music lessons, Saturday trips to the zoo. He had asthma. She found the best pediatrician. Trouble reading? She hired a tutor. She taught him how to braid hair on his dolls so he'd know how to care for a daughter someday. Made him write thank you notes after Christmas, and never, not once, missed a parent-teacher meeting. But not everything stayed perfect. As Elijah grew, things changed. In middle school, he began asking questions. Why am I different from you? Why do people stare at us in stores? Why does everyone think I'm adopted? She always answered the same. Because you are. But that doesn't mean you're not my son. He never fully accepted it. In high school, he grew distant. In college, he barely came home. And when he did, it was brief. An overnight stay, a quick dinner, a "Hey, Mom," before rushing out, phone in hand. But Eleanor never complained. She kept the lights on, his old room just the way he left it, and held on to the belief that love, even quiet love, was enough. Then, her husband Harold passed away, and suddenly Elijah started showing up more. At first he was helpful, cleaned the gutters, mowed the lawn, reminded her to take her blood pressure meds. Sometimes he brought Madison, and they'd sit on the porch while Eleanor baked cornbread and watched her soaps. She thought things were healing. But what she didn't know was that Elijah hadn't come home to rebuild a bond. He came to take stock, and by the time she realized it, her name was no longer on the deed, and her trust was traded for scraps.
But a mother never forgets, and Eleanor was beginning to remember every sacrifice she had ever made. That night, Eleanor slept in her car, parked 2 blocks away from what used to be her house, right across from a row of rundown townhomes with peeling paint and plastic chairs on the porches. She didn't cry, not once, but her hands stayed locked on the steering wheel. At 10 minutes to 2, long after the engine had cooled, the rotisserie chicken still sat untouched in the passenger seat, cold now, the grease soaking through the plastic. She stared through the windshield, eyes focused on nothing. Grief weighs heavy, not just from losing people, but from realizing who they never really were. When her husband Harold died 3 years ago from a misdiagnosed blood clot, Eleanor thought that was as deep as pain could go. He had been her balance, a man of few words, but every one of them meaningful. They met at church, fell in love over fried fish and Bible verses, and spent 29 years building a home rooted in faith and forgiveness. But this pain, this betrayal, stung differently. The next morning, Eleanor went to the bank to check her account. Part habit, part necessity. It was almost funny. Her balance hadn't changed, because Elijah had never touched that money, because Elijah didn't even know it existed. After Harold's death, the hospital tried to dodge responsibility, called it a natural complication. But Eleanor had been a nurse far too long not to recognize the pattern. She pushed back, filed complaints, called an old lawyer friend, and 2 years later, she won a medical malpractice suit no one thought she'd pull off. $9 million. She didn't tell a soul, not even Elijah. She moved the money into a separate trust under her maiden name, spread across several accounts. Not paranoia, peace of mind, something sacred. Because money changes people, and some things are best kept buried. Sitting in that bank lobby, ankles swollen and spirit shattered, Eleanor realized something else. Elijah hadn't just betrayed her trust. He had underestimated her. She might have lost the house, but she still had resources. She still had knowledge, and she still had a weapon Elijah had never learned how to wield: patience. So she booked a cheap motel in Springfield, Illinois, paid in cash, 2 nights, no questions asked. She needed a plan, but more than that, she needed quiet. She needed to remember who the hell she was. She flipped through an old notebook she kept in her purse, filled with prayers, phone numbers, handwritten notes to call a cousin in Dayton. On the last page was something she had scribbled years ago, on the day the settlement came through. Don't let money make you loud. Let it bring you silence. Let it buy you time. She smiled at the page. Elijah thought he had evicted her, but he had just set her free. Freedom doesn't mean comfort, not yet. and Eleanor still had a few fires to walk through before she could rise from the ashes. The first time Elijah placed a stack of papers in front of her was on a Sunday. Eleanor had been at the kitchen table folding dish towels while the oven baked cornbread. Her knees ached that day. The rain was coming. She could feel it in her bones. But she smiled anyway. Elijah had shown up unannounced, and though she didn't care for surprises, she told herself maybe he just missed her. He wore one of those tight dress shirts that always looked like they belonged to someone else. Madison trailed behind, eyes glued to her phone. "Hey, Mom," he said, giving her a half hug. "We brought some paperwork. Nothing serious, just stuff to help with taxes in the house, clearing up some loose ends, you know." Eleanor furrowed her brow. "What kind of papers?" Elijah pulled out a folder like a magician with a deck of cards. Investment forms, property transfers, a power of attorney. We had it reviewed. Madison's office handles this kind of thing all the time. Totally routine.
Madison chimed in from behind the screen, eyes still glued to her phone. "It's just a way to protect your assets, Miss Eleanor. Avoid probate. You'd still be covered for everything." "I didn't ask to avoid anything," Eleanor said quietly, her hands resting on the unfolded dish towel. Elijah laughed. I know. That's why we're doing it for you. Look, if something were to happen, God forbid, it would be a mess to untangle the house and your name on all the documents. This just keeps it in the family." Eleanor stared at the papers. The letters blurred slightly. She didn't wear her reading glasses often. She hated how they pinched the sides of her nose. Elijah noticed. "Here," he said, handing her a pen. "I highlighted the signature lines. Don't worry about the rest. I already went over everything with them." She hesitated. She wanted to say something like, "Maybe I should have someone look at this," or "Why do you need power of attorney now?" But Elijah was her baby, her little boy who cried when she walked past his crib, who needed his inhaler every time he got too excited, the one she stayed up all night with when he got chickenpox at age 6 and wouldn't sleep unless he was holding her hand. So she signed, page after page. He even joked as she scribbled her name. "Are you writing a novel, Mom?" She let out a breath that passed for a laugh. The oven timer dinged, and she got up to turn off the cornbread. That moment stayed with her for weeks. The smell of cinnamon and baking bread, the click of the pen cap, and the smile on Madison's face that seemed just a little too satisfied. She didn't know it then, but that afternoon would be the last time she sat at that kitchen table. The visits got shorter after that. Elijah started showing up with bank statements and investor friends she had no desire to meet. He was always busy, always talking about flipping properties, building portfolios, how her house was idle capital waiting to be unlocked. He started calling her Eleanor in front of Madison. That was new. And one day, as she watered her begonias in the front yard, she overheard Madison say, "Once we close this deal, we can finally get that apartment in Dayton." That's when Eleanor began packing a small bag, just in case. She tucked away her Bible, her documents, the last photo she had of Harold, and her little notebook with the banking information from the malpractice settlement Elijah never knew about. Her body wasn't quick anymore, but her mind, her mind was still sharp enough to know when love had soured. But Eleanor hadn't come this far to watch everything she built vanish, not without reminding Elijah whose name he had signed away and discarded. The day Elijah called her a guest in her own home, Eleanor didn't say a word. It was a Wednesday afternoon. She had just finished vacuuming the living room, something she still liked to do herself, even though her niece scolded her for overexerting. Dust didn't care about age, and Eleanor believed in a clean house whether people noticed or not. Elijah walked in, sunglasses still on, headphones hanging around his neck. Madison trailed behind, mid-conversation with someone over Bluetooth. Neither said a word, just walked right past her like she was the maid. Then Elijah paused, turned around casually, and said, Hey, next time you use the vacuum, empty the bag, will you? We've got people coming to see the house this weekend. Eleanor blinked. People?
Realtors. Just to get a sense of the value, market research. She looked at him. You're selling the house? He laughed like she'd asked if he was moving to Mars. Not yet, just thinking about the future. Got to explore our options, right? She straightened. Our options? That's when he said it. You're a guest now, Mom. Still your space, of course, but legally, well, you know how it is. Her hand tightened on the vacuum handle. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just nodded once. That night she packed her real bag. She didn't take much, just what she needed, that Bible, her notebook, 2 dresses, a pair of sneakers, and her wedding ring, which she hadn't worn since Harold passed, but still kept in a small pouch beside her bed. Elijah didn't ask where she was going. Madison didn't care. They had what they wanted, or so they thought. Eleanor checked into a cheap motel on the other side of town, near a gas station and a truck stop with a flickering neon light. The bed creaked when she sat down, and the heater wheezed like it had asthma. But it was hers, and it was quiet. She sat at the tiny table and opened her notebook. There was a number she'd kept for 14 years. It belonged to a woman named Doris, who used to work at a non-profit that helped older women navigate housing law. Doris had once helped her when a tenant at one of her rental units tried to sue her over a plumbing issue. She dialed the number. 1 ring, 2, disconnected. She sighed. Then she remembered Joe Carlson. Joe Carlson was an old neighbor and Harold's friend, a lawyer, long since retired, but sharp as a tack and twice as stubborn. She hadn't spoken to him in years, but picked up the phone anyway. It rang 6 times before a tired, raspy voice answered, "This better be Jesus or a serious problem." Eleanor smiled. "It might be both, Joe. It's Eleanor." "Eleanor? Woman, is that really you? I need to talk to you." But Joe Carlson didn't need much convincing, because real friends remember who shows up with a chicken pot pie after your surgery. And he kind of been waiting for a call like this. Joe met her at a roadside diner the next morning, one of those places that still served coffee in thick ceramic mugs and called everyone hun or sweetheart, whether they were 5 or 85. He looked older than he remembered, white beard now, eyes a bit glassier, but still had those thick eyebrows and dry wit that made people think twice before lying to him. "You look like hell," he said, sliding into the booth across from her. Eleanor smiled. "Good morning to you, too." He took a sip of black coffee. No cream, no sugar, just like Harold used to drink. "All right, Joe Carlson," she said, setting down her mug. "Tell me everything. No soft landings, no skipping. Just give it to me straight."
So she told him. She told him about the forms Elijah had made her sign, the way he'd changed the locks, the guest comment, Madison, the realtors, the fake smiles. Joe Carlson listened without interrupting once. When she finished, he leaned back and let out a long sigh. He played you, took advantage of you, but he made one big mistake. What's that? He forgot who raised him. Eleanor stared down at the napkin. "I signed over the deed, Joe Carlson." "Yeah, but signing under false pretenses doesn't necessarily make it legal, especially if you weren't fully informed or if he misrepresented what those documents were." She raised an eyebrow. "You think we can take him to court?" Joe Carlson smirked. "Eleanor, I could take him to court blindfolded." She laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. "I'm tired, Joe Carlson. I'm not trying to ruin him. I want my house back. And I want to look in the mirror again without feeling like a fool." Joe nodded slowly.
Then we won't ruin him. We'll teach him a lesson. They spent the next 2 hours going over everything she had signed, what dates she remembered, every conversation she could recall. Eleanor had written most of it down in her notebook anyway, an old nurse's habit, document everything. Joe told her what to expect next, what kind of lawyer he'd connect her with, how they'd file a petition to investigate whether the transfer was fraudulent, and what to do if it escalated to court. Then Eleanor said something she hadn't told anyone else. "I have money, Joe Carlson." "You mean like a little savings?" "No, I mean real money, from the hospital lawsuit. $9 million. Joe Carlson nearly dropped his mug. "Jesus Christ!" "I never touched it. Didn't want Elijah to know. Didn't want anyone to know, honestly." Joe slowly shook his head. "You've been sitting on $9 million and letting that boy play you?" "I didn't want the money to change the way I loved him," she whispered. Joe didn't respond right away. He just looked at her for a long moment, then reached across the table and touched her hand. "It didn't," he said. "He changed all on his own." Eleanor looked out the window at the distant highway. Her reflection in the glass looked older than she felt. Tired, not broken, but cracked, like something that had fallen and refused to shatter. She turned back to Joe Carlson. "I want to do this the right way. No drama, no cameras. I just want my name back on my front door." Joe nodded. "We'll get it." But there was one last conversation Eleanor needed to have, before lawyers, before hearings. One final attempt, not with the man Elijah had become, but with the boy she remembered. She didn't call ahead. She knew if she did, he'd ignore the call, or worse, send Madison to speak for him. So she just showed up. It was late afternoon when she pulled into the driveway. The yard looked too neat, like someone had trimmed the hedges just enough to impress a stranger, but not enough to show real care. Her begonias were gone. She knocked once. Elijah opened the door in gym shorts and a sweatshirt, holding a smoothie. His face tightened the second he saw her. "Mom, Eleanor, what are you doing here?" Eleanor stepped forward just enough for the screen door to stand between them. "I won't take much of your time. I just came to say one thing."
He glanced over his shoulder, probably checking if Madison was home, then sighed and stepped out onto the porch. "Look, if this is about the house," she raised her hand. "Let me finish." He fell silent. "I raised you when no one else wanted to. Not because I had to, not because I wanted to thank you. I did it because I saw a child who needed love, and I gave you every drop I had." Elijah's eyes flickered, but he didn't speak. "I watched you grow. I gave up vacations, sleep, time, even my body. I gave everything to you, and not once did I ever make you feel like a guest in this life." She took a deep breath, her throat tightening. "And you repaid me with a signature and a changed lock." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You signed, Mom. It's not like I forced you. Don't call me Mom unless you mean it." Silence. She squared her shoulders. "I'm not here to argue, just to tell you, I know what you did. And you should know, I'm not broke. Never was. I have enough money to buy this house 10 times over." His face shifted, first disbelief, then panic, then something like shame. "I didn't know that." "You weren't supposed to," she said, "because love isn't a transaction, and loyalty can't be bought. But now I know, and so do you.
He opened his mouth, but no words came out. "I've spoken with a lawyer. This is going to take the path it needs to take. I just wanted to look you in the eye one last time before it does." Elijah's hand dropped to his side. "You're going to sue me?" "No," she said. "I'm going to remind you of the price of a real home." And with that, she turned and walked back to her car. No shouting, no begging, just a woman who had finally remembered her worth. But lawsuits don't scare people like Eleanor. What scares them is seeing the person they underestimated rise stronger than ever. 3 months later, the house was empty. No furniture, no Madison, no Elijah. The new owner, a retired teacher from Springfield, Ohio, said the place felt heavy when she first stepped in, like it had been through something. And it had. Joe Carlson worked fast. The fraud petition flew through the courts faster than expected. The judge barely blinked after reviewing the documents and Eleanor's testimony. Said she had clearly been misled, and the transfer happened under questionable, likely manipulative circumstances. Elijah never showed up to the hearing. He had already left the state. Madison moved back to Dayton without him. Eleanor didn't smile. She didn't laugh. She just exhaled, long and slow, like something had been holding its breath inside her, and now it was finally free. But she didn't go back. Too many memories, too many ghosts of silent betrayals and Sunday dinners that now felt like rehearsals for goodbye. Instead, she took her money, her entire untouched inheritance, and did something no one expected. She bought 3 small houses in Columbus, Ohio. Not big, not flashy, just enough. She turned them into safe homes for women over 60 who had been evicted, displaced, or abandoned by their families. She called the little program Walter's Place, in honor of her late husband. Said it was the kind of thing he would have done if he'd lived long enough to retire. The first resident was a woman named Alma, 74 years old, kicked out by her grandson when she could no longer care full-time for the great-grandchildren. The second was Marlene, whose own daughter sold her house while she was still recovering from hip surgery.
Eleanor cooked Sunday lunches for all of them. Sometimes they watched daytime talk shows. Sometimes they just sat on the porch and shared stories about who had hurt them and how they survived anyway. Eleanor never had to explain her story. They could see it in the way she carried herself. Calm, steady, unapologetic. Joe Carlson still came by now and then, especially when the paperwork piled up. He joked about putting her on a billboard, the woman who turned betrayal into a new beginning. Eleanor would chuckle and wave it off. "I just did what my mother taught me. When they back you into a corner, you don't fold, you pray, you plant your feet, and you protect your peace." But Eleanor knew this was never about a house. It was about not letting a single act of betrayal define the life she had built with her own hands. 1 year later, Eleanor sat on the back porch of Walter's Place with a cup of tea and a fleece blanket in her lap. The Columbus sky was streaked with orange and gold, the kind of sunset that makes silence feel sacred. Alma was upstairs crocheting. Marlene was in the kitchen, humming softly as she cleaned collard greens. And Eleanor, for the first time in a long while, felt quiet. Not busy, not angry, not hurt. Just quiet. A letter had arrived that morning. No return address, just her name, written in handwriting she hadn't seen in nearly a year. Inside, a note. "I messed up. I see that now. I don't know why I did what I did. Maybe I thought I was owed something. Maybe I never really understood what you gave me. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted to say this. You didn't deserve what I did. I hope you're doing okay. Elijah." Eleanor read it twice, then carefully folded it and tucked it into the back of her Bible. Not because she planned to forget, but because some things are meant to be remembered, not relived. She didn't write back. She didn't need to. To her, forgiveness wasn't about relieving him of guilt. It was about freeing herself from the influence of what he'd done. She knew something now she hadn't known before. You can love someone completely, raise them right, give them everything, and still lose them. Not because of who you were, but because of who they chose to become. And that's not a shame you have to carry. Eleanor leaned back in her chair as the crickets began tuning up their nighttime symphony. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, the kind that fills more than lungs. It filled her memory. It filled her meaning. A home wasn't just a roof. It was the people beneath it. And she had built a new one from the ground up. No signatures required. If this story touched something deep in you, if it reminded you of someone you've lost, loved, or let go, share it with a friend who needs to hear it. And remember this: real love can't be stolen. Real mothers don't give up. And real strength doesn't shout. It rebuilds, quietly, from the ground up.